The day Delia Sullivan sold the last acre of the only home she had ever known, the sky above Harlan County, Texas, turned the color of a bruise purple and yellow and sick with heat, as if the land itself understood what was being taken from it. It was the summer of 1882, and the drought had been cruel that year, the kind of cruel that does not apologize. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the Sullivan property had gone to nothing but cracked mud and memory by June, and the corn that Delia had planted with her own 2 hands in April had shriveled to brown paper by the first week of July. She had prayed over those rows every morning, kneeling in the dirt until her knees were raw, and the Lord had not seen fit to answer her in any way that made the corn grow taller. She was 31 years old, and she had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Patrick Sullivan, had died of a fever that had come on fast and left no room for goodbyes, and he had taken with him not only the warmth of the bed they shared, but also the confidence that everything would somehow be all right. Patrick had been the kind of man who believed in tomorrow. Delia had loved him fiercely for that quality, even as she sometimes envied it, because she was the kind of woman who counted what was in the larder before she went to sleep. What was in the larder now was not enough. Her son, Thomas, was 8 years old and the most important thing in her life. He had Patrick's dark hair and his father's way of tilting his head when he was thinking hard about something, and he had developed a cough in late spring that had started soft and polite and grown into something that rattled in his chest like a stone in a tin cup. Doc Alderman in town had looked at the boy in May and said what he feared without saying it plainly, the way doctors did when they were afraid of the words themselves. He had spoken about the dry air and the dust, and the need for rest and proper food and medicine from the apothecary in San Antonio, and he had written a number on a slip of paper and handed it to Delia without meeting her eyes. The number was $47. $47 for the medicine that might quiet the cough before it became something that could not be quieted. $47 for the tinctures and powders that Doc Alderman had described in careful language, things that had come from a physician in the East who had studied this particular kind of lung ailment in children, things that were not available at the general store in Harlan, but could be ordered from the city if a person had the means to pay for them. Delia had not had $47. She had not had $20. She had, at that point in the early summer, $22 and change to her name, and half of that was earmarked for the property tax that Mr. Calhoun at the county office would come to collect in August with his ledger and his polished boots and his complete indifference to a widow's difficulty. She had sold what she could sell first. Patrick's saddle, which had been a good one, hand-tooled by a craftsman in Abilene and worth real money, had gone to the livery man for $11. She had sold 2 of the 3 remaining chickens, which left her with 1 laying hen and a great deal of silence in the mornings. She had sold the silver candlesticks that had been her mother's wedding gift, an act that had required her to stand in the general store for a full minute with her hands pressed flat on the counter before she could let go of them. And still, she had been $12 short of what she needed, $12 short of what might save her boy. It was then that she had begun to think about the land. The Sullivan property was 43 acres, or rather had been 43 acres when Patrick was alive. Over the course of the previous year, as the debts of a dead man with no savings accumulated in ways that a living man would have prevented, Delia had already sold off 37 acres in 2 separate transactions to Abel Marsh, who owned the neighboring cattle operation and had been eyeing the Sullivan land since before Patrick was cold in the ground. She had not liked Abel Marsh when Patrick was alive, and she liked him considerably less now that he was her neighbor and her creditor, but he had cash money and she had needed it to survive the winter and keep the property tax current and buy food for Thomas. That left 6 acres. The house sat on 2 of them, the kitchen garden on 1, and the remaining 3 were the southern pasture where Patrick had kept a small herd of cattle that had long since been sold. Those 3 acres of pasture were the last acres. They were the ones she had sworn to herself she would keep, not because they were especially valuable or productive, but because they were the boundary between what she still had and what she had lost. And as long as she held them, she could still call herself a landowner and not a charity case. But Thomas's cough had grown worse in July, and Doc Alderman had come to the house one evening near the end of the month and listened to the boy's chest and looked at Delia with an expression that she had understood completely. The way a woman who has already buried one person she loves completely understands the language of faces that are trying to be kind. She had walked the 3 southern acres that evening after Doc Alderman left, walked them in the blue dark with the cicadas screaming in the mesquite and the heat still pressing down like a hand, and she had made her peace with it. Or rather, she had made what peace she could, which was not very much. The next morning she had driven the wagon into town and gone to the office of Silas Crane, who handled property transactions in Harlan County. She had told him she wanted to sell 3 acres. He had asked her the parcel number and written it down, and told her that Abel Marsh had already expressed interest in exactly that parcel, that he would send a message to Marsh and expect a response by afternoon. The response came in 2 hours. Abel Marsh offered $38 for the 3 acres of southern pasture. Silas Crane had looked at her over his spectacles and said nothing, which was its own kind of communication. The parcel was worth $60 at fair market value, possibly more, given that it shared a boundary with Marsh's existing property and gave him clean access to the creek road. $38 was not an offer made in good faith. It was an offer made by a man who understood that a desperate woman had no room to negotiate, and who intended to take full advantage of that fact. Delia had sat in the wooden chair across from Silas Crane's desk and felt the specific humiliation of having no choice, the way it settled into a person's bones and made them feel both small and furious at the same time. She was furious. She did not let it show on her face because showing it would not change anything, and she did not have the luxury of gestures that cost her something without returning anything. She had accepted the offer. That was the morning of August the 4th, 1882, and she was standing outside Silas Crane's office waiting for the papers to be drawn up when the stranger rode into Harlan. She noticed him the way you notice something that is slightly different from everything around it, the way you notice a quiet sound in a noisy room. He was riding a good horse, a dark bay with clean legs and a patient temperament, and he sat in the saddle with the kind of easy authority that comes not from showing off, but from having spent a great deal of time on horseback without thinking about it. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, lean and brown from the sun, with dark hair and a jaw that carried a few days of beard that had not been attended to recently, but was not disreputable. He wore a plain canvas coat despite the heat, and his hat was good quality but not new, pushed back on his head in a way that meant he was not particularly concerned with appearances. He tied his horse at the rail in front of the general store, and he went inside, and that was that. Delia went back inside Silas Crane's office and signed the papers that gave Abel Marsh her 3 acres of southern pasture for $38, and she took the money and put it in her coat pocket and walked to Doc Alderman's. And Doc Alderman wrote out the order for the medicines from San Antonio and took 31 of her dollars and told her the medicines would arrive on the stage in approximately 2 weeks if the weather held and the roads were clear. She came out of the doctor's office into the white noon heat and stood on the boardwalk with $6 remaining in her pocket and the deed to a property that was now just the house and the kitchen garden, not quite 3 acres in total, and she felt as though she had been wrung out like a wet cloth. She was so occupied with the arithmetic of her remaining resources that she nearly collided with the stranger from the bay horse as he came around the corner of the hardware store carrying a length of rope and a set of iron hinges. He caught her by the elbow before she stumbled. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and even, not the kind of voice that made a production of itself. "My fault entirely," she said, and stepped back and looked up at him. He had gray eyes, the particular gray of water just before it rains, and they were steady and clear, and they looked at her with a directness that was polite rather than presumptuous. He tipped his hat with his free hand, the hand not holding the rope and hinges. "Reuben Covington," he said. She had not asked for his name. He had offered it the way a man offers a hand before a handshake, as a kind of assurance. She appreciated it without knowing why. "Delia Sullivan," she said. He nodded once, the way men did when they were filing information away, and he stepped aside to let her pass, and she walked to where her wagon was hitched and climbed up and drove home. The drive home took 40 minutes, and she spent most of them in the particular silence that follows a large decision that cannot be undone. The land was gone. The money was spent, or would be spent when the medicines arrived. Thomas would have his treatment. That was the thing that mattered, and she said it to herself firmly and more than once, because she understood that if she did not keep hold of that thought, it would be easy to get lost in grief about the rest of it. Thomas was sitting on the porch step when she pulled in, drawing something in the dirt with a stick. He looked up when the wagon came into the yard, and his face did what it always did when she came home, which was open up like a flower turning toward light. That expression, the simple, uncalculated joy of it, was the thing that kept her going on days when keeping going required considerable effort. "Did you get it?" he asked. He knew she had been to see Doc Alderman. She had told him about the medicine, presenting it with careful optimism, the way she presented everything that was uncertain. "The order is placed," she said. 2 weeks and it will be here." Thomas absorbed this and then looked back at his drawing in the dirt, which was a horse and a reasonably good one for 8 years old. "Will it make the cough stop?" "Doc Alderman thinks it will help a great deal." Thomas considered this. "Mama," he said, "are we poor now?" She climbed down from the wagon and sat on the step beside him and looked at the dirt horse. "We are careful," she said. "There is a difference." He seemed to accept this, and she was grateful that 8-year-old boys were generally willing to accept things when they were said with enough quiet certainty. That evening she made a supper of salt pork and beans and cornbread from the last of the corn flour. And while Thomas slept, she sat at the kitchen table with a stub of candle and her accounts book, and went over the figures with the focused dread of someone who already knows what the numbers say and is looking for a mistake they have not yet found. There was no mistake. There was the house, and the kitchen garden, and $6, and 2 weeks until the medicine arrived, and after that the question of how they were going to make it through the autumn. She closed the accounts book and blew out the candle and went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to her son breathe in the next room, the small, uneven sound of it, and she thought about what needed doing next. She thought about the widow Mac Callum south of town who had mentioned needing someone to take in sewing. She thought about the schoolteacher position that had been vacant since Miss Hart left in the spring, and she wondered if the school board would consider a woman with no formal training, only the education she had given herself over years of determined reading. She thought about all of it in the methodical way she thought about things when she was frightened, turning the problems over and examining each side. She fell asleep eventually, and when she dreamed of nothing memorable, only the brown fields and the dry creek bed, and somewhere in the distance the sound of hooves on packed earth. 2 days after she had signed the papers for the southern pasture, Silas Crane rode out to the Sullivan property. This was unusual. Silas Crane was not the kind of man who rode out to see people. People came to Silas Crane because Silas Crane charged by the hour and generally felt that his presence anywhere other than behind his desk was a professional indulgence. Delia was hanging washing on the line when she saw him coming up the road, and she stood with a wet pillowcase in her hands and watched him ride up with the uncertain feeling of someone who is not expecting news and suspects the unexpected news will not be pleasant. He dismounted without particular elegance and took off his hat, which was a concession that meant the visit was not entirely official. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said. "Mr. Crane." She finished pinning the pillowcase and turned to face him. "What brings you out this way?" He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was something resembling puzzlement. "There has been a development regarding the sale of the southern parcel," he said. The cold feeling moved through her fast. "Is there a problem with the deed?" "No problem with the deed," he said. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope, and he held it out to her. "That is for you." She took it. It was sealed and had her name written on the front in an unfamiliar hand, neat and unhurried. She looked at it and then at him. "What is this?" "I believe if you open it, you will understand the situation better than I can explain it," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite discomfort and not quite amusement, something in between. She broke the seal. Inside was the deed to the 3 acres of southern pasture and a note. The note said, "Mrs. Sullivan, I purchased this parcel this morning from Mr. Marsh, who had not yet recorded it with the county. I am returning the deed to you. I ask nothing in return except, if you are willing, the name of the woman I encountered outside Harlan Hardware 2 days past, whose name I believe I already have, but whose circumstances I did not then fully understand. Forgive the presumption of a stranger. The land is yours. The choice of what to do with it is yours also. R. Covington." Delia read the note twice. She read it a third time. Then she looked at Silas Crane, who was watching her with the expression of a man who has been instructed not to editorialize and is finding this instruction difficult to follow. "He bought it from Marsh," she said. "This morning. Paid Marsh $62 for it, which was, I'll say, rather more than Marsh paid you for it." The fury that she had swallowed 2 days ago in Silas Crane's office came back briefly and then was overtaken by something more complicated. "And he is returning it. So it appears." She looked at the deed in her hand. The paper was cool and slightly stiff, the way legal documents were. She looked at the note. "R. Covington. Where is he?" she asked. "He is at present, I believe, at the Harlan House Hotel," Crane said. "He wrote in 3 days ago and has not yet stated his intentions regarding a longer stay." "Is he a landman, a speculator?" Crane shook his head slowly. "He told me he is a rancher, or was. He sold his operation up in the Panhandle last spring. He mentioned looking for property in this county." She folded the note and the deed together and held them in both hands and looked out at the southern pasture, which was dry and brown and utterly ordinary and also, apparently, hers again. "Thank you, Mr. Crane," she said. He put his hat back on. "I'd say it is an unusual situation, Mrs. Sullivan." "It is that," she agreed. He rode away, and she stood in the yard for a long time after the sound of his horse faded, holding the deed and the note and thinking about Reuben Covington. She did not go to the hotel that day. She needed to think first, because she was the kind of woman who thought before she acted, and because she was not entirely sure what she intended to say to a man who had spent $62 to return something to her without asking for money back, a thing that made no financial sense, and yet had apparently been done with complete deliberateness. She made supper and got Thomas to bed and sat on the porch in the dark with the note in her lap, and she listened to the night sounds, the coyotes somewhere to the west, the wind moving through the dry grass, and she tried to determine what she thought about Reuben Covington. What she thought, she realized eventually, was that she was intensely curious about him. That was the dominant feeling. Not suspicion, though she had considered and re-examined it carefully. Not gratitude, though that was present too. Mostly she was curious in a way she had not been curious about anything for a long time. She went to town the next morning, which was a Thursday. The Harlan House was the only hotel in town, a 2-story wood-frame building that also served as the stage stop. The woman at the desk told her that Mr. Covington was out, but that he usually came in for his supper at 6. Delia went to the widow McCallum's house and asked about the sewing work, and Mrs. McCallum was delighted and gave her a bundle of shirts that needed turning and mending, which would pay $2 when completed. Then she went to the schoolhouse and spoke with the chairman of the school board, a man named Henderson who had known her father, and he said he would bring the matter of her appointment to the board at their next meeting the following week. She went back to the Harlan house at 6:05. Reuben Covington was at a corner table with a cup of coffee and a plate of something that had clearly just been set before him. He looked up when she came in, and she had the distinct sensation that he recognized her before she spoke, which she supposed made sense since they had met outside the hardware store. But there was something in the way he looked at her that suggested he had been thinking about her too, and that this knowledge had been organized and waiting. She walked directly to his table, because she was not the kind of woman who hesitated once she had decided to do something. "Mr. Covington," she said. He stood, which she had not expected, and gestured to the chair across from him. "Mrs. Sullivan, please." He sat. He folded his hands on the table and looked at her with those gray eyes that were calm and watchful both at once. "I received your note," she said. "I supposed you might come," he said. He did not say it with any arrogance. He said it as a simple statement of probability. "I want to understand what it is you think you are doing," she said. She had decided to be direct because she did not have the time or the patience for anything else, and because she suspected, from 2 brief encounters, that he would respond better to directness than to careful management. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I rode into this town 3 days ago looking at the countryside with the intention of buying land. I saw a woman outside this hardware store who was carrying herself with the particular posture of someone who has just done something very hard. I spoke to you, and you told me your name, and then I went and made some inquiries, as I do when I am in a new place, and I learned your situation." "From whom?" she asked. She was not angry about this, only curious. "Silas Crane was forthcoming once I explained my interest. He did not volunteer anything you would not have told me yourself, I think. He said you had sold 3 acres to Abel Marsh that morning, and that the price had not been fair, and that you had a son who was ill." She absorbed this. "And then you bought the parcel from Marsh." "I went to Marsh and told him I was interested in the parcel and asked his price. He said $70. I said 62 and told him I would pay in cash before the day was out. He took it." He paused. "He is not a man I found myself liking particularly." "He is not," she agreed, and something in her face must have shifted because a brief smile crossed his face and then disappeared back to its usual composure. "And now you've returned it to me," she said. "You spent $62 of your own money on land you then gave away, and you told me you asked nothing in return except my name, which you already had." "The name was a way of introducing myself properly," he said. "That was poorly worded. I do not want your land. I want nothing from you that you are not willing to give." She studied him. He did not look away, but he also did not lean forward or try to press the point. He was simply there, patient and plain, the way the land was plain, without pretense. "Why?" she asked. "You are a stranger. This is nothing to you." He considered the question with genuine seriousness, as if it deserved a careful answer. "I grew up in circumstances that required people to be kind to my family when they had no obligation to be," he said. "My father died when I was 12, and we lost our property in a year, and strangers made it possible for my mother and my sister and me to keep going. I have carried that debt for a long time, and I have not always had the opportunity to pay it in a way that was meaningful." "And you think paying $62 for a stranger's pasture is meaningful?" "I think a woman with a sick child and $6 to her name needs her land more than I need $62, he said simply. The simplicity of it was what got her. It was not flowery. It was not designed to impress. It was just the statement of a man who had looked at a situation and made a decision according to a set of values that were so deeply his own that he did not seem to notice they were unusual. She did not speak for a moment. Outside, someone's horse was shifting at the hitching rail, and the cook in the kitchen was doing something loud with pots. "Thank you," she said at last. "I do not have words adequate for what you have done, and I am not certain I should accept it because it does not feel right to accept that kind of generosity from someone I do not know. But I have a son who is ill, and I have 3 acres back that I sold for less than they were worth because I had no choice, and I am going to say thank you and mean it with everything I have." He nodded. "How is the boy?" "His name is Thomas," she said, and she was not sure why she told him the name immediately, only that it felt right to say it. "He is 8 years old. Doc Alderman has ordered medicine from San Antonio. It should come in 2 weeks." "Good," he said, and the word was warm and real. She stood to leave, and then she stopped because she found that she did not entirely want to go yet, which was a feeling she had not had in 14 months. "You said you came to this county looking for land," she said. "Do you intend to stay?" "That depends on what I find," he said, and his eyes were steady on hers when he said it, and the words had a second meaning that she did not ignore, only filed carefully away to examine later. She went home. Over the next 2 weeks, the medicine from San Antonio came in on the stage, and she began giving it to Thomas each morning and evening, measuring it carefully with the little glass measure that Doc Alderman had given her. She worked on the Widow McCallum's shirts in the evenings. She got word from Henderson that the school board had agreed to let her take the teaching position on a trial basis through the end of the year, at a salary of $22 a month, which was not a fortune but was enough, barely, if she was careful. She saw Reuben Covington 4 times during those 2 weeks. Once on the road, when he was riding and she was driving the wagon, and they stopped and spoke for several minutes about nothing particular: the weather, the state of the roads, the general disposition of the local cattle. Once at the general store, where they both reached for the same sack of flour at the same moment and laughed, the first time she had laughed properly in what felt like a very long time. Once he stopped by the property, which she had told him was welcome when she had seen him on the road, and he spent 20 minutes on the porch with Thomas, showing the boy a particular way to braid rope that Thomas found immediately fascinating. Once at the church on Sunday, where he sat 2 pews behind her and nodded when she turned at the end of the service. Each time she saw him, she noticed something new about him. She noticed that he listened the way few people listened, with his full attention, and without preparing his next sentence while you were still speaking. She noticed that he was competent with his hands in a way that was simply matter of fact, that he fixed the loose porch board without making a ceremony of it, and showed Thomas the rope braiding as casually as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. She noticed that he made no attempt to crowd her, that he was present without being insistent, and that this quality, which she might have appreciated in anyone, in him felt like something particular to his nature. She was teaching school by the end of August, 23 students ranging from 6 to 15 years old, in the one-room schoolhouse at the edge of town. It was hard work and she loved it completely. She had always been a woman who liked purpose, and standing in front of those children with a piece of chalk in her hand, and the particular challenge of making something clear to minds that were all different shapes, she felt, for the first time since Patrick had died, that she was fully herself. Thomas's cough was improving. By the 3rd week of the medicine, the rattling had softened and the color had returned to his face, and Doc Alderman, when he examined him in early September, used the word encouraging with the genuine enthusiasm of a man who had been worried, and was no longer quite so worried. She held that word in her chest like a coal through the whole drive home. It was in September that things between her and Reuben Covington began to change in a way that was too clear to pretend was happening gradually. He had ridden out to the Sullivan property on a Wednesday afternoon in the 2nd week of September, with the stated intention of looking at the condition of the fence line along the southern pasture, which had been in his view when he walked the property before returning the deed, and which he had noticed was in some disrepair. This was, she recognized, a reason constructed around a desire, but it was also a genuine and practical thing that needed doing, and she was not going to pretend she was not glad to see him. Thomas was at school, being educated by a different teacher since Delia could not teach her own son's class without bias, and she was home that afternoon because she had a head cold that made standing in front of 23 children impractical. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the accounts book when he knocked, and when she opened the door she was conscious, in a way that she had been trying not to be conscious of and was now unable to avoid, that Reuben Covington was a very good-looking man, and that she was standing in her work dress with her hair not entirely tidy, and that she was annoyed with herself for minding. She did not let the annoyance show. She invited him in for tea because she had been raised to offer tea, and he took the cup she gave him and sat at the kitchen table and looked around the kitchen with the honest interest of a man who is looking at a place and trying to understand it. "You made this place work," he said, looking at the shelves she had built along the west wall using boards from the old chicken coop. "I made it work as best I could," she said. "That is more than most." He turned the cup in his hands. "How is Thomas?" "Better every week," she said, and could not keep the gratitude out of her voice. "The cough is almost gone." "He is a fine boy," he said, and then he looked at her directly and said, "You are doing a remarkable thing raising him alone." She shook her head because she did not like being called remarkable. Remarkable was what people called women who did hard things when they thought the women could not hear the pity underneath the word. "He makes it easy," she said. "He is a good child." "He gets that from somewhere," he said quietly. She looked at him. He was looking at her with that steady gray gaze, not pressing anything, not asking for anything, just looking at her as if she were something worth looking at, and she felt the warmth of it move through her in a way she had not felt in a long time and had not expected to feel today. "Reuben," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she heard herself say it as if from slightly outside herself. "Yes," he said. "What is it that you want from me?" She asked it the way she had asked the first time, directly, but this time the question did not mean what it had meant the first time. He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window at a low angle and lay across the table between them, and she could hear the wind in the dry grass outside and the sound of her own heartbeat, which was somewhat faster than usual. "I want to know you," he said. "I want to spend time in your company. I want, if you are willing to allow it, to see whether what I think I am beginning to feel is something you could ever feel also." It was honest to the point of discomfort, and she appreciated it precisely because it was uncomfortable, because it did not wrap the thing in polite vagueness or pretend to be asking about something simpler. "I am not," she said carefully, "an uncomplicated woman to consider. I have a son. I have a teaching position and a property that is 3 acres. I'm not looking for someone to rescue me. I spent a long time being afraid of what I could not control, and I have only recently begun to feel steady on my feet again, and I am wary of anything that might knock me sideways." "I am not interested in rescuing you," he said. "I am interested in knowing you. Those are very different things." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the things she had been thinking about over the past 3 weeks, the careful way she had been cataloging him, the things she had noticed, the way he had been with Thomas on the porch, and the way he had sat in the pew 2 rows behind her, and the way he had laughed with her over the flour at the general store. "Tell me about the Panhandle," she said. He looked briefly surprised, and then he told her. He had bought his land up there at 23, he said, working for wages for 6 years after his father died until he had enough saved for the down payment, and he had built it from 20 acres to 480 over 12 years, running cattle with 2 hired men and doing most of the labor himself. He had sold it in April because the Panhandle was changing, big operations moving in, the kind of money that a single man running his own spread could not compete with long-term, and because he had been restless in a way he had not fully understood until he was already driving south. "No family?" she asked. "My mother passed 3 years ago," he said. "My sister is married, lives in Fort Worth. I'm not a man who has built a great deal in the way of personal connection, to be honest. I have been a man of work and land and not much else for a long time." "Why not?" He thought about this. "I suppose I have been waiting," he said, "without knowing what I was waiting for." He said this without drama, just as a fact, and she felt the words settle in her chest and stay there. They sat at that kitchen table until the shadows in the room went long, and Thomas came home from school. And Thomas immediately spotted Reuben in the kitchen, and came through the door with a question already forming about the rope braiding. And the afternoon shifted from something weighted and personal to something lighter. The three of them at the table while Thomas showed what he had practiced, and Reuben showed him the next step. And Delia watched them and felt something dangerous and wonderful begin to happen in her heart. After supper, which Reuben stayed for because Thomas asked him to, and because Delia set an extra plate without being asked, he helped her wash the dishes. They stood side by side at the wash basin, she washing and he drying, and the domesticity of it was so ordinary and so charged at the same time that she did not know whether to laugh or cry. "I appreciate this," she said, meaning the washing up. "I appreciate the supper," he said. They looked at each other. Thomas was already asleep down the hall, having worn himself out with the rope braiding, and the house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet late in the evening when the day's work is finished, a particular kind of full silence. He put the dish towel down and turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and the distance between them was not very large. "Delia," he said. Her name in his mouth was careful and serious. "Yes," she said, which was the same answer he had given her earlier. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with one hand, a gesture so gentle it was barely there. She held very still, because she was not afraid of him, only of herself, of how much she wanted him to continue. "I think," he said, "that I have been looking for this county and not knowing it." She put her hand against his chest, feeling the warmth of him through his shirt, and she said, "Do not say things to me that you do not mean." "I have never in my life said a thing I did not mean," he said, and she believed him completely, because in all the weeks she had known him he had not said a single thing that was not exactly what he meant. "Then we ought to go slowly," she said. "As slowly as you need," he said, and the steadiness of it, the complete absence of impatience, was more reassuring than any declaration would have been. He left a while later, riding out on the dark road with his lamp swaying, and she stood on the porch until the light disappeared around the bend, and she pressed her hand to her sternum where she could still feel the warmth of where she had touched him, and she said his name quietly to herself in the dark. Reuben. It was a good name. It suited him. The weeks that followed were some of the most quietly extraordinary of Delia Sullivan's life, and she knew they were extraordinary even while they were happening, which is the kind of awareness that does not come to everyone. He came to supper twice a week, and on Saturdays he came earlier and helped with whatever needed doing, the fence line of the southern pasture that he had already partially mended, the roof of the barn that had been needing attention since spring, a new gate for the kitchen garden that he built from scratch in an afternoon, while Thomas handed him nails and asked him questions about everything. He was good with Thomas in a way that was not performed. He did not patronize the boy or talk down to him. He talked to him the way an older man talks to a boy he respects, explaining things fully, listening to questions fully. And Thomas, who had grown up with a father who had that same quality, responded to Reuben with a trust that was deep and easy, and that Delia found herself watching with an ache in her chest that was not sad but almost unbearably sweet. The romance of it unfolded with the same unhurried deliberateness that characterized Reuben in general. He brought her wildflowers once, the small yellow ones that grew along the creek road, and he handed them to her without ceremony, and said he had noticed she liked yellow. She had not known she had mentioned this and later could not think when she had, but he was right. She did like yellow. He noticed things about her the way he noticed things about land and weather, carefully and without making a show of it. She found herself telling him things she had not told anyone. About Patrick, about those last weeks of his illness, about the way grief had felt in the immediate aftermath like a physical weight on her sternum that she could not put down. She told him about her parents, who had come to Texas from Missouri in the early days and built something here from nothing, and about her mother's death when she was 17 and how it had made her grow up quickly. She told him about the silver candlesticks, and he listened without flinching at the sadness of it. He told her things too, about building the Panhandle Ranch, the years of it, what it felt like to wake up at 4 in the morning and go to work on something that was entirely yours, built from your own labor. About his father, who had been a good man taken too soon, and about his mother, who had been resilient in ways that he had not fully understood until he was an adult. One evening in late September they were sitting on the porch after supper, Thomas asleep inside, and the sky was doing extraordinary things with the sunset, all red and gold above the flat horizon, and Reuben said, "I have been looking at a property." She turned to look at him. "In this county, south of town, about 3 miles, 50 acres with a good well and a sound house and adequate fencing. The man who owns it wants to sell and go back east." She felt something tighten in her chest, and she identified it after a moment as anxiety, the particular anxiety of someone who has begun to rely on a presence and is afraid of what it means when that presence might go somewhere 50 acres away. "Is it what you are looking for?" she asked. "It depends," he said, and he was looking at the sunset rather than at her, which was deliberate, she thought, because it gave her space. "On what?" she asked. He turned and looked at her now. "On whether 50 acres 3 miles south of Harlan is where I want to build something." The directness of what he was not quite saying was present between them, taking up space on the porch. "You have not been here 3 months," she said. "I am aware of that," he said. "I am also aware that I have been a decisive man my whole life, and I know my own mind, and I am not speaking in haste. I have been thinking about this since August." "Reuben," she said, and stopped. "You do not have to say anything," he said. "I am not asking you anything tonight. I am telling you what I am thinking about because I think you deserve to know the direction I am looking. I am not a man who surprises people against their will." She sat with this for a while. The sunset faded from red to purple to the deep blue of early evening, and the first star came out low on the horizon, and the coyotes began somewhere far away. "I have been afraid," she said eventually. "Of what?" "Of needing someone again," she said. "Of allowing myself to need someone and then losing them. Patrick was here and then he was not, and the world kept going with this enormous gap in it that nothing fit into, and I swore to myself that I would build something that did not require a particular person's presence to stand." "That is a wise thing to swear," he said. "Except," she said, and stopped again. "Except," he said quietly, inviting her to continue. "Except I think the thing I swore was about not being reckless. I did not swear to feel nothing. I did not swear to keep every door closed." She looked at her hands in her lap. "And I find that I have been building something regardless, without particularly intending to." He reached over and put his hand over hers, just that, his broad, warm hand over both of hers in her lap, and they sat there in the growing dark with the coyotes yipping in the distance and the land around them dry and patient. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I am going to buy that 50 acres and build something on it, and I am going to be 3 miles down the road and continue to come to supper twice a week and help with the fence and teach Thomas how to braid rope, and I am going to do all of this for as long as it takes for you to feel ready for whatever comes next, if anything does." She turned her hand over under his and held it. She looked out at the dark land. "You are a profoundly stubborn man," she said. "Thoroughly," he agreed. She laughed, and the laugh came from somewhere real and warm, and she heard it in the air and was not surprised that it sounded lighter than anything she had produced in 14 months. He squeezed her hand once and let go, and the letting go was itself a kind of statement, a demonstration of what he had promised. The October Fair was a Harlan County tradition, held on the second weekend of October each year. A 2-day event with livestock competitions and pie judging, and a dance on Saturday night. Delia went every year, and this year she went with Thomas, who had recovered sufficiently that Doc Alderman had given his full approval of outdoor activities, and who was, as a result, in a state of barely contained excitement all the way to town. Reuben met them at the fairground gate. Thomas saw him first and ran ahead, and Reuben caught him with one arm and swung him around once in a move that made the boy shriek with delight, and that caused several nearby adults to look over with the specific expression people reserve for things that are clearly what they are, a man and a boy and a woman who are something to each other. The three of them walked the fair together, and Delia was conscious of how they appeared and then conscious of not minding. She and Reuben walked beside each other with Thomas ranging ahead and doubling back the way small boys do, and they ate sugar-roasted pecans from a paper cone and watched the cattle competition, and Thomas won a penny at the ring-toss booth and lost it back at the next booth, and was philosophical about this in a way that made Reuben quietly impressed. In the afternoon there was a pie judging, and Delia had entered her apple pie, which was excellent, and she came in second, and the woman who came in first gave her a look of competitive satisfaction that Delia met with complete serenity. Reuben bought a slice of both the first place and the second place pies, and ate them side by side, and declared the judging to have been a miscarriage of justice, which made Delia feel both gratified and embarrassed about feeling gratified. The dance on Saturday night was held in the barn beside the fairground, and Thomas stayed with a neighbor's family who had children his age for the evening. Delia arrived at the dance in the best dress she owned, a deep green wool that she had kept in paper since Patrick's last Christmas, and Reuben was waiting outside the barn doors. He looked at her in the green dress for a long moment without speaking, and she felt the look the way you feel the sun come out after a cold morning. "You look beautiful," he said, and it was not a line, it was just a true thing plainly stated. "You clean up well yourself," she said, which was accurate. He had shaved and found a good dark jacket from somewhere, and he was the kind of man who wore good clothes with the same unpretentious ease with which he wore his work clothes. They danced. She had forgotten how much she liked dancing. The musicians were local, a fiddler and a banjo player and a young man on harmonica who was very enthusiastic if not always precise, and the music was the kind that gets into your legs without asking permission. Reuben was a confident dancer, not showy, just sure of the steps and sure of her, his hand steady at her waist and his lead clear but not controlling, and dancing with him was easy in the way that things were easy with him generally. The barn was warm with bodies and lamplight, and the smell of hay and autumn outside, and somewhere in the second hour of dancing, during a slower piece from the fiddler that made the crowd thin to couples and not groups, Reuben pulled her a little closer and she went without question, and they danced in the particular close way of people who have tacitly agreed about something without yet putting words to it. His cheek was near her hair, and she could feel the warmth of him all along her side, and she thought about what she had said on the porch in September, about building something without intending to, and she understood that what she had been building was this particular feeling, this person, and that it was built far enough now that pretending otherwise would just be a kind of foolishness. "Reuben," she said quietly against his shoulder. "Yes," he said, "I would like you to ask me something." He was quiet for a beat and she felt his hand tighten slightly at her waist. "What would you like me to ask you, Delia? I think you know." He stopped dancing. They were standing still in the middle of the slow song, and some people looked at them and most people did not. He took her hand and walked her to the side of the barn, out through the side door into the cool October night, and they stood in the dark with the music coming muffled through the boards and the stars overhead so many and so bright they were almost too much. He turned to face her. "Delia Sullivan," he said, and his voice was very low and very serious. "I rode into this county knowing nothing about it and found the only thing I have been looking for without knowing I was looking. I am not a man of a great number of words. I will tell you that I love you, and I will tell you that I want to build something with you that is better than either of us could build alone. And I will tell you that Thomas is already as important to me as any child I could claim. And I will ask you plainly whether you would be willing to be my wife." She stood in the October dark and looked at him, at those gray, steady eyes that had been steady since the first time she had looked into them outside the hardware store, and she thought about the widow she had been a year ago, the $6, the dry land, the rattling cough in the night, and she thought about how extraordinary it was that the worst moment of her life had also been the moment that had led to this. "Yes," she said. "Reuben Covington, the answer is yes." He stepped forward and she stepped forward and he kissed her, there in the dark outside the barn with the fiddle playing and the stars overhead. And the kiss was exactly what he was, certain and warm and patient and real. And she felt herself come home to something she had not known she had left. They were married on the first Saturday of December, 1882, in the Harlan County Church with the white wooden steeple and the crooked north window that let in a draft. It was a small ceremony, which was what she wanted, attended by Thomas and Reuben's sister Clara, who had ridden down from Fort Worth for the occasion, and who was a warm and practical woman of 32 who shook Delia's hand at the door of the church and said, "I am so glad he found you. You have no idea," with a directness that Delia liked immediately. The preacher's name was Reverend Hobbs, and he performed the service with the slightly emotional enthusiasm of a man who genuinely believed in what he was performing. And Delia stood beside Reuben in the church and felt the solemnity of it without the weight that solemnity can sometimes carry, because this was not solemn in the sense of being heavy, only serious in the way that real things are serious. Thomas stood beside Reuben during the vows. He had asked if he could do this, and no one had seen any reason to refuse him, and he stood very straight in his good shirt and held Reuben's hand, and watched his mother with an expression of such complete approval that it made Clara cry quietly into her handkerchief 2 rows back. After the ceremony there was a supper at the house, Delia's house, which was already in the process of becoming their house, and the table was full because the town of Harlan had opinions about who was invited whether you did the inviting or not. And Henderson from the school board came, and Doc Alderman came, and Silas Crane came with his wife, who turned out to be considerably warmer than her husband and who brought a pie. And the widow Mac Callum came, and a number of others. And it was loud and warm and smelled of roasting meat and wood smoke. Late that night, when the guests were gone and Thomas was asleep and the house was finally quiet, Delia sat on the porch in the cold December air wrapped in her heaviest shawl, and Reuben came out and sat beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him. "Well, Mrs. Covington," he said. "Well, Mr. Covington," she said. They sat in the quiet of the cold night and looked at the dark land, the pasture, the mesquite, the dry grass that would turn green again in spring. And it was all still there, every acre of it, the 3 of the Sullivan property and the 50 that Reuben had purchased south of town, and that they had already begun to think about in terms of what it would hold when they put it together with what she had. The stars were very bright, and the coyotes were quiet for once, and somewhere in the north there was a cloud bank that the wind was pushing south, and that might, by morning, carry the first real cold of winter. "Are you happy?" he asked. She thought about it honestly before she answered, because she was that kind of person, and when she answered she was certain of it. "Yes," she said, "I am happy." "Good," he said, and held her a little closer, and that was enough. The winter was mild, as Texas winters occasionally decide to be, and by February Reuben had moved his operations from the hotel, where he had been living for 4 months with admirable good humor, to the house on the south property, which he worked on steadily through the cold months to make sound and comfortable. He rode to the Sullivan property every morning and every evening, and the road between the 2 places became a familiar track, and Thomas sometimes rode with him on the bay horse in the afternoons, small and proud and increasingly competent in the saddle. In March the rains came, finally and generously, the kind of rain that West Texas saves up for a year and then delivers all at once, and the creek on the eastern edge of the Sullivan property ran full and clear for the first time since before Patrick had died, and the pasture turned green almost overnight in the way the land here will when it gets what it has been waiting for. Delia stood at the edge of the southern pasture, the 3 acres that had gone and come back, and watched the water run in the creek, and she felt grateful with an intensity that made her close her eyes. She was pregnant by then, though she had only told Reuben 3 weeks before and had not yet told anyone else. She pressed her hand briefly against her stomach, a private gesture, and then walked back to the house where she could hear Thomas asking Reuben something about whether the creek would flood. "Not likely, but watch where you step near the bank," she heard Reuben say. She came around the corner of the house, and Reuben looked up at her from where he was standing with Thomas near the fence, and his face did what it did lately when he looked at her, which was warm in a way that was visible from across a yard. "Creek's up," he said. "I saw," she said. "Beautiful." Thomas was already pulling Reuben toward the creek bank to demonstrate the rising water, and Reuben went, because he always went where Thomas led him, and Delia stood in the wet green grass of the yard and watched them go, man and boy, the man tall and steady, the boy quick and bright-voiced. And she thought about Patrick in the careful way she had learned to think about him, with love and gratitude and no more guilt, because love is not a finite thing that diminishes when it is given in new directions. She thought Patrick would have liked Reuben Covington. She believed that completely. In April, they decided to combine the two properties, a decision that required a visit to Silas Crane's office and a great deal of paperwork that Crane seemed to genuinely enjoy. And the result was a holding of 53 acres that Reuben said was a reasonable foundation, and Delia said was more than she had dreamed of when she had stood in this same office 9 months ago with $38 and a broken heart. Crane, filling out the joint deed, had looked up over his spectacles and said, "Life does have its reversals, Mrs. Covington," with the expression of a man who finds this satisfying, and Delia had agreed with him more warmly than she had ever agreed with Silas Crane about anything. Reuben bought 4 cattle in April and 6 in May, starting small and building deliberately, which was how he did everything. The south property's pasture was good grass with the rains, and the small herd grew steadily through the summer, and by August he had added a hired man, a quiet Tejano called Felix, who was steady with cattle and told Thomas about the history of the land in ways that the school did not, and Thomas was fascinated by this and asked questions by the dozen. The school board had offered Delia a permanent position after her trial period ended, and she took it. She taught through the pregnancy, which required at a certain point some adjustment of schedule and the hiring of a temporary assistant, a young woman from Abilene who was visiting relatives. But Delia was not the kind of woman who considered the progression of a pregnancy to be an illness, and she returned to the schoolroom 6 weeks after the baby was born with the energy of someone who has been given both something new and something back. The baby was born in the last week of November, 1883, and was a boy, which Reuben received with a joy so unguarded that it was almost funny, standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands while Doc Alderman was still in the bedroom, wearing an expression of such completely open hope that Delia, exhausted and sore and deeply happy, laughed when she saw it. They named him James Patrick Covington. James after Reuben's father, Patrick after Delia's first husband and Thomas's father, and the combination of names felt right in the way that things feel right when they are made from honesty and respect for what has come before. Thomas held his baby brother for the first time sitting in the rocking chair in the kitchen, very carefully, with the studied concentration of someone who has been told about fragility and is taking it seriously. And his face when the baby gripped his finger was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on him, and she had been watching his face since he was born. "He is very small," Thomas said. "You were smaller," Reuben said, sitting on the floor beside the chair, because he always brought himself down to Thomas's level when they were talking about something important. "Was I?" "Every person is at the beginning," Reuben said. Thomas considered the baby brother in his arms. "I will teach him the rope braiding," he said solemnly. "He will count on that," Delia said. By the spring of 1884 the ranch, for it was a ranch now in a way it had not been when it was 3 acres and a kitchen garden, was producing steadily. Reuben had added more cattle through the winter and had repaired and extended the fence lines and put in a new well on the south section, and done all of it with the methodical patience that was his most consistent characteristic. Felix had become a permanent employee, and there was a second hired hand now, a young man from the town named Carroll who was enthusiastic if occasionally overzealous. The house had changed too. Reuben had added a room to the east end, a proper bedroom for Thomas, and had improved the kitchen with a better stove that Delia had not known how much she needed until she had it. He had done most of this work himself, in the evenings and on Sundays, and he had done it quietly and without making a production of it, the way he did everything. Abel Marsh, whose cattle operation sat just west of the Covington land, had been watching these developments with the specific displeasure of a man who had expected to eventually absorb the Sullivan property entirely, and instead found it growing into a going concern under new management. He had made one attempt in early spring to discuss a property line he claimed was disputed, and Reuben had ridden over to discuss it with him with a copy of the survey in his saddlebag and his good even temper. And whatever Marsh had expected the outcome of that conversation to be, he had come away from it with the property line confirmed, and the manner of a man who has been thoroughly and politely outmaneuvered. Delia had asked Reuben that evening what had been said, and Reuben had told her, and she had felt something that was partly satisfaction and partly the specific pleasure of having a partner who handled difficult men without making more difficulty. "He will not give trouble again," Reuben said. "How do you know?" "Because I told him that we have a survey and a deed in the county records, and that if he wants to spend money on a lawyer disputing a line that is on record going back 8 years, that is his choice, but it will cost him more than it costs us and he will lose." "What did he say to that?" Reuben considered. "He said nothing pleasant, but he shook my hand." She shook her head. Men and their handshakes. But Marsh did not give further trouble, and the spring went well, and the summer of 1884 was kinder than the summer of 1882 had been, the rains coming at reasonable intervals and the grass staying green longer than usual, and the cattle doing well on it. James Patrick Covington learned to walk in the August heat, staggering across the kitchen floor with his arms wide for balance, and the absolute determination of someone who has decided that crawling is no longer adequate. And Thomas was on the floor with him immediately, coaching him in a manner that was probably more hindrance than help, but was so enthusiastic and sincere that no one had the heart to say so. Reuben stood in the kitchen doorway watching his sons because Thomas was his son in every way that the word meant anything, and Delia came and stood beside him, and they watched the baby fall and get up and fall and get up again. "He is stubborn," Thomas announced. "Runs in the family," Reuben said, without looking at Delia, but she saw the corner of his mouth. "Does it?" she said mildly. "Thoroughly," he said, and she laughed and put her arm around his waist, and he put his arm over her shoulders, and they stood like that in the kitchen doorway in the August heat and watched the youngest member of their family determine with complete resolve that falling was not the end of the matter. The schoolroom in the fall of 1884 had 27 students, 4 more than when Delia had started, and she had begun to teach Thomas's class because he was old enough now that she had decided the potential bias was less concerning than the quality of instruction. And Thomas, to his credit, was entirely unbothered by having his mother as his teacher, or if he was bothered, he was diplomatic enough not to show it in the classroom. She had changed the curriculum in small ways over her 2 years of teaching, adding more history, adding more practical mathematics, adding the kind of reading that made children think about the world beyond Harlan County. Henderson had expressed mild reservations about some of this at first, but the parents generally approved, and when 2 of her oldest students went on to the school in Abilene and excelled there, Henderson's reservations had quieted considerably. There was, that fall, a boy in the school named Roberto, the son of Felix's brother who had recently arrived in Harlan with his family, and Roberto was 10 years old and very bright and very quiet, and he was getting a certain amount of difficulty from some of the older boys on account of being a newcomer and a Mexican-American, and Delia addressed this directly and without apology, which was not entirely what the town expected from their schoolteacher, but which produced results. The difficulty stopped. Roberto began to participate in the classroom. By December, he was one of her better students, and Thomas had made him a friend. She had a conversation about this with Reuben one evening, about the injustices she saw in the county, the way certain people were treated as lesser, the way land was taken and opportunity was denied based on things that had nothing to do with a person's worth. "Felix told me about his family," Reuben said. "They have been in this part of Texas for 3 generations, longer than most of the Anglo families who are here now. And they are still treated as though they arrived yesterday," she said. Reuben was quiet for a moment. "It is wrong," he said, "and it is not going to change overnight, but it can be changed a little at a time by people who teach children to see each other plainly." She looked at him. "That is why you let Thomas be with Roberto. That is partly why I told Thomas that Roberto's family knows this land better than we do," he said. "And it is true." She loved him very specifically in that moment, for the plainness of his values and the consistency with which he lived them. The winter of 1884 was harder than the previous one, cold coming early and staying. And there was a week in January when the temperature dropped to something that had no business existing in Texas, and the cattle had to be moved closer to the barn, and the creek froze along its edges for the first time in anyone's recent memory. Felix and Carol worked through it with admirable steadiness, and Reuben was in the field with them every day, and at the end of it, all the cattle were accounted for with only minor losses. James Patrick, 14 months old, found the cold weather deeply offensive and expressed this opinion loudly, until he discovered that the ice on the edge of the water trough was interesting, at which point he transferred his considerable focus to the study of ice and became more agreeable. Thomas had grown over the winter, shooting up through a stretch that gave him the thin, slightly startled look of a boy who has outgrown himself, and he was working alongside Reuben and Felix regularly after school and on weekends, learning the ranch in the serious and systematic way that he approached everything he decided was worth learning. He had his father's dedication, Reuben told Delia one evening, meaning Patrick, and Delia felt the particular rightness of a man who could say that with no competition in it. By the spring of 1885, they were adding to the herd again, and Reuben had begun talking about whether a second hired man permanently stationed on the property would make sense, which was the kind of conversation that would not have been possible 3 years ago, which was itself a measure of how much had changed. Silas Crane, who had become in his reserved and professional way something approaching a friendly presence in their lives, had looked at their accounts in February and told them, with his expression of maximum informational neutrality, that their financial position was sound. Delia had accepted this assessment with the particular satisfaction of someone who had once had $6 and 1 laying hen. In April of 1885, Delia discovered she was pregnant again. She was 34 years old, and Reuben was 37, and James Patrick was a year and a half, and Thomas was 11, and she sat on the porch with the evening coming in gold and warm over the green pasture, and felt the kind of happiness that is made of layers, the immediate kind and the kind that comes from looking back and seeing the distance traveled. When she told Reuben, he sat very still for a moment, and she watched his face do the thing it had done when he was standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands waiting for James Patrick to arrive, that open, unguarded joy that still surprised her because she had not expected that kind of openness from a man who was so generally composed. "Are you well?" he asked, because he was the kind of man who asked that first. "I am very well," she said. He reached across the porch step and took her hand and held it. "This is a good life," he said. "It is," she said. "It is a very good life." They sat in the April evening, and the land around them was green, and the cattle were grazing on the south pasture, and somewhere in the mesquite, a meadowlark was doing what meadowlarks do in April in Texas, filling up the air with something golden and unasked for and completely necessary. Thomas came out of the house behind them with James Patrick on his hip, the baby heavy in content, gnawing on something that Thomas had probably given him from the kitchen without authorization. And Thomas said, "James Patrick smells suspicious," in the tone of an older brother who has already learned that suspicious smells require adult intervention. And the evening shattered into the ordinary domestic comedy of a family that was whole and busy and alive. The second baby, born in the second week of November 1885, was a girl. They named her Clara Ann Covington, Clara after Reuben's sister who wept at the news from Fort Worth and promised to visit by spring, and Ann after Delia's mother, whose silver candlesticks were gone but whose name was not. Thomas, aged 11, held his sister with the same careful gravity with which he had held James Patrick, and James Patrick, aged 2, was brought to look at the baby, and regarded her with the profound suspicion of someone who had only recently finished being the youngest person in the house, and had not been adequately consulted about this development. He came around to her in 2 days, as 2-year-olds will when the thing they were suspicious of turns out to be interesting, and by the end of the first week he was bringing her objects: a wooden spoon, a sock, a small stone from the yard, as gifts in the manner of a person who has decided to be generous. Reuben, holding Clara Ann in the rocking chair on the second evening of her life, looked at Delia across the quiet kitchen, the 2 older boys asleep, the lamp burning low, the ranch outside in the cold November dark, and said, "Delia Sullivan." She looked up from the mending in her lap. He was smiling. Not a wide smile, it was not his nature, but real and warm and utterly content. "I said your name," he said, "the first thing I asked for." She understood what he meant, the note. "I ask nothing in return except your name." "You got considerably more than that," she said. "Yes," he said, "I did." He looked down at Clara Ann, small and sleeping in the crook of his arm, and then back at Delia, and she set aside the mending and went to him, and she sat on the arm of the rocking chair and leaned her head against his, the 3 of them. And outside the ranch was quiet, and the stars were cold and bright, and the creek ran clear along the eastern edge of the land that was theirs. There was a morning in the spring of 1886, when Clara Ann was 4 months old and the grass was new green, and the mesquite was doing the hesitant thing it does when it is deciding to bud, when Delia walked the southern pasture before the rest of the household was awake. She did this sometimes, walked the land in the early morning when the light was flat and clear, and the dew was still on the grass, and the air had not yet been heated to its daily opinion of itself. She walked the 3 acres that had been hers, that she had sold and that had come back, and she walked to the edge of them where they joined the larger south property, and she stood at the boundary and looked out over the 50 acres of good grass and the cattle moving on it, and the windmill that Reuben had put in over the winter turning slowly in the early breeze, and she thought about August of 1882. She thought about the deed and the note. She thought about standing outside Silas Crane's office with $38 and a broken heart and a desperate plan. She thought about Reuben Covington riding into Harlan on a dark bay horse with a length of rope and a set of iron hinges, and about gray eyes that looked at her with a directness that was polite rather than presumptuous, and about the moment in Crane's office when she had folded the note over the deed, and understood that a stranger had done something that had no practical explanation, except that he was the kind of man who did things like that. She thought about all of it, and she was grateful for it, even the worst of it, because the worst of it was the road that had led here, and here was a place worth reaching. She heard the back door of the house and turned, and Reuben was coming across the yard with 2 cups, because he always knew when she was up before him and he always brought coffee. He was in his work clothes already, suspenders and his canvas coat, his hat pushed back, the same man he had been the day she first saw him, only known now entirely and in all his specifics. He came to where she was standing and handed her the cup and stood beside her and looked out at the morning land. "Thinking," he said. "Remembering," she said. He nodded because he often understood without more explanation. They stood together in the morning air with their coffee, and the windmill turned, and the cattle moved in the grass, and behind them the house held their children, sleeping or beginning to wake, and the school bell would ring in 2 hours and Delia would be there with chalk in her hand and 27 minds to fill with the world, and Felix and Carol were already at the barn, their voices carrying faintly in the morning quiet. Thomas would be up soon. He was always up early now, eager for the ranch in the way of a boy who has found his purpose, and he would come out in his work clothes and ask Reuben what needed doing and mean it, and Reuben would tell him, and they would go do it together, man and boy, and Delia would watch them go and feel the particular fullness of a life that is exactly what it should be. James Patrick would wake loudly, because he woke every morning as though the day were an emergency requiring immediate response, and Clara Ann would be fed and brought out into the morning air, and for a while the yard would be full of voices and the ordinary beloved chaos of a family going about itself. And in the evening they would come back together, all of them, around the table, and there would be supper and talk and Thomas's questions and James Patrick's opinions delivered in 2-year-old syntax that required some interpretation, and Clara Ann's calm observation of the world from whatever arm was holding her. And after the children were down, there would be the porch and the night sky and the two of them, as there always was. "What are you going to do today?" she asked him. "The east fence section needs work before the rains come," he said. "Felix thinks the northwest corner post is rotting. He is probably right. He usually is. He drank his coffee. And you?" "Arithmetic today," she said. "The older students are ready for fractions and I have been putting it off because fractions require patience." "You have patience." "I have patience," she agreed. "The question is whether they do," he smiled. She had never tired of his smiles, the way they came out as if they had been waiting for just the right moment. She thought she would never tire of them, and this was not a romantic notion but a simple observation, the way she observed things. The sun came up over the flat horizon and lit the mesquite and the grass and the water in the creek, and the light fell across the southern pasture, her 3 acres, and the 50 beyond it, and the house, and Reuben Covington standing beside her with his coffee and his good steady presence, and Delia Sullivan, who was also Delia Covington but who would always be Delia Sullivan inside, looked at all of it and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. She put her hand on his arm, and he covered it with his, and they stood in the morning of 1886 on the land that was theirs, and watched the sun come up on the life they had built from the rubble of one August, and the extraordinary, impractical, grace of God kindness of a stranger who had ridden into town on a dark bay horse, and asked only for her name,